This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelical Christians in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party. This episode can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back and start at the beginning of Season 6. This is The New Right. Open your mailbox or your email inbox, and what do you find? If you're like a lot of us, it's junk mail. I recently got together with my twin brother Nick Starrin and went over some of ours. Hey Nick, how's it going?
I'm doing pretty well, yeah.
Yeah, nothing more fun on a cheerful Wednesday than opening junk mail.
Oh boy, I can't wait. Let me get my letter opener.
Some of this is pretty good. So this is like an Awana card that it's encouraging preschool curriculum.
Yeah.
And Awana being like a Bible memorization program here at the church.
For kids, yeah, we already have an Awana. It's something that it already goes on here. So I feel pretty good about that.
Pretty good, yeah. This is one of those things that I've never understood about junk mail, is that it's often trying to sell a product to somebody who is already buying the product.
Yeah, that is a little strange, isn't it? Yeah, we're in. We don't need this. We're good. Yeah, the QR code means nothing to me.
So we have one that is a card about, and I actually think the slogan on this is really funny. The way we abbreviate advertisements, I think, is kind of hilarious in its own way. But it says, ready-made events so you can focus on what matters, the women.
Don't we matter too?
What are they going for?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. That one is confusing.
Ready-made events so you can focus on what matters, the women. I don't know.
The women don't seem to focus on us in anything.
Yeah, they seem pretty oblivious.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like there's some speakers and stuff.
Some speakers, yeah. Yet another conference. We
definitely need more conferences.
Yeah, to focus on the women. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
There are some emails that I've gotten, so we can kind of open up.
I have some too.
I went to the National Religious Broadcasters Convention a few years ago, and Zion Oil and Gas, this oil company that is trying to drill for oil in Israel.
Oh, geez.
Sends me updates constantly. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong with,
getting Christians involved in getting oil in the Middle East?
Yeah, that sounds like a terrible thing.
And so I have one from a listener named Bruce Williams, and he was sent this email. For decades, the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, and the rest of the federal judiciary have policed their own ethics standards, and it's been a complete disaster. So this one fits with a lot of the stuff we're actually talking about this season, where people are, blasting the Supreme Court. And this is just some junk mail that he got. Dinesh D'Souza, who I mentioned in this season of the podcast.
Yep, and it talks about his son-in-law who's a patriot. So you definitely need to lead off a patriot.
Yeah, just because he's a football player.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, that's Patriots.
Oh, I mean, maybe he is. I don't know. Much.
This is one I thought was fun. It is a devotional based on pickleball called Dink Positive Thoughts, a pickleball devotional.
No, that's kind of fun.
That one, yeah. See, at least it's got a colorful cover and stuff.
That's good. Yeah. I wonder if they're patriots. They didn't outline that in there.
Yeah. A listener named Heather sent this in, and it's a book she found at a used bookstore. This comes from St. Matthew's Churches, which is a group of prosperity gospel churches. It is like a thick comic book, but it is very strange. And this big quote in different font.
Yeah, it says, winners in big letters develop a habit of doing things losers don't like to do. Wow.
Yeah.
That is. And right next to it is a picture of Moses and
with
the Lord
the
called Moses on the Ten Commandments. They're pairing these two things together.
It's such a weird contrast because you have that prosperity gospel thing with a totally out of context picture of Moses with the Ten Commandments, and then
the maintain wealth consciousness and become mindful that money is a good thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
I remember that in the Ten Commandments, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's there.
The reason we're covering this is because in the 1970s, there was a group of guys that got together called the New Right, and they really perfected this kind of marketing. They didn't invent it, but they perfected a new kind of marketing that tied politics and religion in a very effective fundraising model. And so that's what we're talking about today.
Oh, exciting. Can we get rid of this junk mail now?
Yes, let's put this in the recycling bin.
Except for that pickleball one.
Yeah.
Where's that at?
You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. we press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.
The very poor fortunes of the Republican Party in the mid-1970s can be attributed to one word: Watergate.
Watergate was the scandal, or a series of scandals really, that involved money laundering, breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters, bribes paid to the vice president, even attempts to use the IRS to bludgeon enemies of the president, eventually ending in the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974. Oh, and the voice you heard there is Rick Perlstein.
I'm Rick Perlstein. I'm a historian. I write about American politics, especially the rise of the right.
In a series starting with Before the Storm that explores the presidential run of Barry Goldwater and concludes with Reaganland, America's Right Turn. If you can only read one book from this season, let it be Reaganland. Okay, so Watergate goes down. Enthusiasm for the Republican Party, the party of Nixon, wanes. During the mid to late 1970s, pundits predicted that the Republican Party was close to extinction. A poll done for Gerald Ford's team put the number of voters loyal to the GOP at just 18%. Nixon was a crook. The rest of the party was guilty by association in the eyes of some voters. Then his successor, Gerald Ford, pardoned him. This is from the television broadcast of him doing just that. Note how he ties in Christianity just before he pardons Nixon. And remember, Nixon was the candidate who ran on law and order, and he's just about to get a special favor and escape prison.
As we are a nation under God, so I am sworn to uphold our laws with the help of God. And I have sought such guidance and searched my own conscience with special diligence to determine the right thing for me to do with respect to my predecessor in this place, Richard Nixon.
The broadcast continues.
And by these presents do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
If you get time, I think it's worth watching the whole broadcast. It's a fascinating moment in American history.
Richard Nixon was someone ever since the 1940s who was deeply associated with the Republican Party. He was its biggest star all through the 1950s.
So when he fell, he implicated the entire Republican Party.
It's an interesting question about what the future portends for the Republican Party as you go into the 1976 presidential election.
When the competition was largely between Jimmy Carter and the incumbent Gerald Ford, pundits at the time came up with a way to save the GOP.
The Republican Party had to purge its association with the right wing. It had to make much stronger inroads among minority communities, interestingly enough. But if you listen to conservative activists at the time, their answer has always been the same. The Republican Party fails when it's not conservative enough.
One group wanted to reach out to minorities, a big deal after the so-called Southern strategy, in which the administration had largely not enforced existing laws that protect African Americans. This new strategy would expand the base. Before Nixon and Goldwater, the Republican Party had been the party of black people. Now they were losing them. Yet another faction of the Republican Party wanted to become more conservative. Then Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976, and it didn't look good for Republicans.
There was discussion of the Republican Party basically going the way of the Whigs.
In the 1974 midterm elections, the Democrats won their greatest post-war majority, gathering 60% of the votes and claiming 48 House seats that had formerly been occupied by Republicans.
Only a third of state legislators were Republicans. They controlled the state house and the legislature only in 4 states and had so few governors, according to one pundit, that 2 checker cabs could carry them. And his reason he gave, and this is another guy from the Boston Globe, was that the party of Abraham Lincoln forgot its heritage and started neglecting minorities.
Not everyone agreed with that assessment of why the party was doing so poorly. Ronald Reagan, who failed to get the Republican nomination in 1976, said the party was, essentially, wimpy. Reagan, at the time, was seen as extreme.
The Boston Globe's Washington correspondent said that after Ronald Reagan, lost that run in 1976 for the nomination against Gerald Ford, that Richard Nixon had a better chance of becoming president in 1980 than Ronald Reagan.
That was maybe a bit premature. Pundits left and right predicted the end of the GOP, but the party was on the rebound just 2 years after it was expected to die. This was not by accident. A new, small, but influential group emerged. It posed as a grassroots movement, but really was the exact opposite. They were driven by direct mailing, donations from big business, and extreme economic ideas. Their movement combined with the tax revolt of the late 70s to utterly change the political landscape in the United States. To boot, they were the people perhaps most responsible for tying evangelical Christians to the Republican Party, though most evangelical Christians have probably never heard of them.
So the new right is a really interesting phrase. People use it kind of generically, like they'll refer to the kind of post-liberal followers of Donald Trump as the new right. But it meant something very specific. It was a very specific group of people, a rather small group of people.
They claimed to be nonpartisan, but their opinions had specific themes. While people on the left might say that big business was involved in exploitation at the time, the new right argued that the problem was left-wing media elites shoving the 1960s down people's throats. Things like anti-war campaigns and Johnson's Great Society that gave tax dollars to poor people. They described federal bureaucracies as hungry for tax dollars. Conservatism in the minds of the new right was the ideology of working people.
And they all surrounded basically the social and cultural consequences of the revolutions of the 1960s. One of their leading acolytes was a guy named Paul Weyrich, whose name may be familiar to people who follow evangelicals in politics. He said the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party was sex. In other words, things like gay rights, things like campaigning for gender equality and the Equal Rights Amendment.
Rick mentioned Paul Weyrich, or Weyrich, depending on who you ask. He was really influential in tying evangelicals to Ronald Reagan and getting Reagan elected, but he was not loyal to the party. Weyrich was not about allegiances, even to Reagan. He was a man bent on specific ideas. Weyrich's contribution to the movement is that he knew how to organize people, a skill he learned from watching liberal protests. He was a former radio newsman from Wisconsin, member of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, which he joined when he thought the Roman Catholic Church was too liberal. Weyrich carried some of his former Catholicism with him, including his objections to abortion. Here's an actor reading a quote from him.
"We must not stand by helpless while our freedom is completely robbed from us. We must not sit here and do nothing while 9 men rule that the unborn have no right to life. We cannot permit the secularist religion to determine our earthly salvation."
That was in 1973, while abortion was not on the radar of mainstream evangelicals. It was still considered a Catholic issue. He saw these things not as disagreements, but as doing battle for God. I'm going to share another quote with you, this one from the New Right Papers. Listen for some things we've covered over the years: fear of communism and socialism, pro-business bents, and a sense that we're the good guys and those people over there are wicked.
"It is basic to my philosophy that God's truth ought to be manifest politically. Collectivism, which is what the left is advocating for in 1,000 guises, is an error. The New Right Coalition is the only organized, substantial effort opposing and speaking truth to its power. I believe with truth on our side, we have great cause for hope."
Did you hear it? He's fighting one extreme idea, collectivism, with another. According to one historian, in the 1970s, conservatives were jealous of the successful organizing done by liberal groups like the Brookings Institution.
Envious conservatives watch the powerful liberal coalition of academics, think tank analysts, members of Congress, White House aides, interest group officials, and journalists run much of the business of the nation's capital and wondered, why can't we put together an operation like that? And wondered some more. Yet the answer was clear. There was no conservative alternative to the Brookings Institution, the catalyst for many of the legislative successes of the liberals during the 1960s and early 1970s.
One of those envious conservatives was Paul Weyrich. In his early years in Washington during the Nixon administration, he stumbled into a meeting over a housing bill. There he saw all these different players working together. A newspaper columnist who would write a positive article, an African-American Senate lobbyist, Senate staffers, an analyst from the Brookings Institute. Each did their part. Weyrich was like, why can't we conservatives do this? Why can't we get all of our players to work together? Thus was born the Heritage Foundation, a think tank that he and a friend started with money from Joseph Coors, the beer magnate. Now, what do think tanks do? Essentially, they do research, or sometimes quote-unquote research, package their objectives, and market them to members of Congress. Within 4 months of the founding, the Heritage Foundation bragged about killing several wage and price controls, cutting federal funding of mass transit, revoking access to food stamps for strikers, and made progress towards a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The next year, one of their key battles was defending militants in Kanawha County, West Virginia. When disagreements over school books erupted into hostility, angry parents shot at police cars that were escorting school buses, blocked transportation offices, and bombed school buildings. A nasty mess, which the Heritage Foundation used to draw attention to itself by sending lawyers to defend domestic terrorists. Weyrich quit Heritage because he saw the group as too liberal, and then founded the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress. One reporter described Weyrich in this way.
His mien is that of a formal, slightly constipated owl. He speaks in the clipped phrases of a man in a hurry.
His goal was not to mobilize people to vote, but to get his kind of people to vote. He and his cohorts, whose politics didn't actually fit the Republican agenda in the early 1970s, were determined to pull the sinking ship up, radicalize it, and send it in a new direction. Weyrich had a black and white view of social issues, and he said, and this is an actor reading the line,
ultimately, everything can be reduced to right and wrong. Everything. We see everything in black and white perspectives because Scripture sees things in black and white perspective.
Weyrich was a follower of R.J. Rushdoony. You remember him. Rushdoony founded a theology called Christian Reconstruction, which taught that Old Testament law should be the ultimate blueprint for American government. For example, stoning people for their sins, including gay people. He said that if we got the family in order, it would fix the church, which would then fix the government. He was also influential in the modern homeschooling movement, saying that sending your kids to public school was like making them wards of the state. Weyrich followed this guy. Paul Weyrich was also influential in the founding of the Moral Majority, to the point of coining the term. We'll get there soon. It was an organization, really several organizations, bent on tying religious people to the GOP. We've only really covered Paul Weyrich. When we return, we'll talk about more members of the New Right and how their movement changed the face of the Republican Party. While you listen to these ads, why not help me make more truce? Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to see how you can help, or find @trucepodcast on Venmo. Okay, here come the ads. Hey friends, a few weeks ago I went to a fascinating talk where the guy who invented the infinite scroll told us about the future of AI. According to him, scientists are now predicting that we're just a few years away from the majority of the content on the internet being AI generated. It was a wild talk, and it reinforced to me how important it is to have real stories told by real people using reliable sources. And that's what Truce is. When it comes to fundraising, we're doing pretty well, but things are still pretty tight on this end. And I have a goal of someday hiring staff for the show. If you'd like to be a part of making Truce more sustainable, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Even $10 a month goes a long way. Even if now's not the time for you to give money, there are so many ways to help out. For one, you can email your favorite history, religious, or chit-chat podcasts and suggest that they interview me for their show. 2, leave a 5-star review on your podcasting app. 3, post about Truce on social media. You can share an episode or one of the many videos I've been making on social media. Finally, and most importantly, remember the show in prayer. Thanks for listening to Truce, a real show made by a real person about real issues. Welcome back. Let me introduce you to another member of the New Right. Like Paul Weyrich, this guy was also a follower of R.J. Rushdoony.
Another of the leading New Right organizers was a guy named Howard Phillips. He had been born Jewish, but he converted to evangelical Christianity.
In 1971, he was appointed by Richard Nixon to head the Office of Economic Opportunity. It sounds like a boring bureaucracy, but believe it or not, it was almost the topic for Season 6 of this very podcast. The OEO was envisioned in the Kennedy years and carried out under President Johnson. It managed things like the War on Poverty, Head Start, the Job Corps, and more. It was the capstone of social programs supported by Democrats. Then Howard Phillips was brought in with a secret mission from the Nixon White House: dismantle the OEO from inside. The press found out and he was fired. But he had already managed to staff it with like-minded conservatives, who continued to do the job. He also created his own think tank, the Conservative Caucus.
And he said what the new right is we organize discontent, which basically meant things that people were angry about. And they weren't necessarily traditional political issues about, the allocation of resources or how to do tax policy or things involving foreign policy and taking on the Soviet Union. He meant stuff like gay rights, the ERA, textbooks that promoted allegedly liberal ideas. And they would find these often quite local controversies over, say, textbooks in a rural area in West Virginia, or the fight over a gay rights ordinance in Miami-Dade County in Florida. And they would try to fan these local issues into national issues that people could vote on in elections.
They organized discontent. They used emotion, not reason or logic, to get people to follow their lead. They believed that liberals controlled the mainstream media. So to get around it, they used direct mail. The junk mail we talked about at the beginning of the episode. In an era before personal computers, you could cheaply get messages into the mailboxes of voters by targeting their demographics.
They were using a media that was outside of the mainstream media, and they were quite explicit about it. The same kind of rhetoric we hear now about the mainstream media as being, captured by liberals, by radicals, by, communist sympathizers. We need these direct mail letters, telling people that people are burning Bibles all over the country to get around this corrupted fake news, basically.
Their mastermind behind direct mail campaigns was Richard Viguerie. You may never have heard of Richard Viguerie, but you felt the impact of his legacy. Think of him next time you or somebody you know gets something in the mail that looks like an official newspaper or personalized letter that is actually propaganda for some political cause. It was Richard Viguerie's mailing campaigns that raised money for things like the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, Anita Bryant Ministries, Gun Owners of America, and the fight to keep the Panama Canal from going back to the people of Panama, that I started the season with. They were behind all of it.
Richard Viguerie was a brilliant, devious, and cunning and quite greedy figure. He's still with us, and you'll often kind of see him quoted as an expert on what conservatives are thinking, at least in the kind of era of Donald Trump. He was a young fella who wanted to get involved in politics. When I interviewed him once for my first book on Barry Goldwater, he told me his two heroes were the two Macs, General MacArthur and Joseph McCarthy.
McCarthy being the former U.S. senator who, in the 1950s, ran a witch hunt looking for communists in the federal government and military, often with little or no evidence to back his claims.
He came from Texas. He came from a working class background, and that was another distinguishing feature about a lot of these new right guys. They did not grow up going to country clubs. Their parents often lived very hard scrabble existences. His mother raised cows to feed the family when he was growing up in Texas. And he came to New York to be a fundraiser for this new conservative group that came about in 1960 called Young Americans for Freedom, that was created kind of in association with the people around National Review. And he met the kind of front man for this group, who was not young. He was a guy named Marvin Liebman. And the first thing Marvin Liebman told him, and this comes from Richard Viguerie's own mouth, is that you tell them that the group has 10,000 members if it only has 1,000 members, right?
Liebman was the perfect man for Viguerie to learn under. He was a pioneer of political direct mail. Viggory learned how it was done and founded Ravco, which stands for Richard A. Viggory Company, to do marketing of his own.
Right after the Barry Goldwater campaign, Richard Viggory, who's in his earlier mid-20s, shows up at the clerk of the House of Representatives, which was where, under the federal laws then in effect, everyone who donated more than, I believe, $50, which was, not a terribly small amount, but it wasn't a huge amount in 1964 dollars, their names and addresses had to be stored. And he got temp workers, were then called Kelly Girls. That was a firm that would kind of rent you out secretaries. And he told them to just keep on copying names until they kicked you out. He had no idea whether this was legal. He had no idea whether this was legitimate. And by the time someone came around and said, what the heck are these people doing? They had thousands and thousands of names of people who had given money to Barry Goldwater because he was going to save us from the communist incursion from, Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights hordes. And that was the basis of a list that grew to millions and millions and millions and millions of names that was extremely profitable to him.
With this list, Ravco was able to fundraise for the new right, not by traditional means, but by approaching people they knew were already predisposed to giving. Did you give money to candidate X? Well, you're going to love candidate Y. Or if you responded with a check to a fundraiser for Anita Bryant, and you live in a certain district, maybe you'll vote for this issue in your local election. Kind of like shopping online today. You look at a certain camera or television on Google, and suddenly, your ads are all cameras and televisions. Only this was decades earlier.
He would write these letters that he loved to write about, the terrible things that the liberals were doing. He would basically collect more names and more money. And quite frankly, a lot of this money went directly to himself. And he would defend himself by saying, well, yes, we're not giving a lot of it to the candidates we're supporting, but what we're doing is we're kind of raising awareness that this is kind of a form of alternative media.
That's being generous. It was also about money. Viggory was investigated by the House of Representatives, which concluded that little of what Ravco raised for its clients actually got to them. For example, the Reverend Sun Young Moon's Children's Relief Fund only received 6.3% of the over $1.5 million raised on their behalf. An organization hoping to send Bibles to Asia somehow lost money, though Viggory raised almost $890,000 for them. When the House tried to hold him to account by passing a law, Viggory launched a direct mailing campaign and killed the bill, saying that they were not coming for him, but for churches. He used his propaganda machine to protect his propaganda machine.
They call him the funding father of the new right, the godfather.
This is really important. Yes, the new right started out as just a handful of guys upset about taxes, feminism, and the media. But once they raised money, they could funnel it to politicians who agreed with them. Viggory's mailing list did a lot of the heavy lifting. Soon, not only did they have actual dollars, but they used that money to back their kind of candidates.
Suddenly you have this new force on the political scene. At exactly the time that politicians are really beginning to figure out that kind of ordinary, mostly rural folk are horrified at the kind of social reforms in the 1960s working their way into mainstream institutions, working their way into schools, working their way into churches, working their way into workplaces. What we now call, the woke mind virus. It's the exact same logic.
They spread fear with letters meant to terrify average Americans. All these guys, Weyrich, Phillips, Viggory, and others of their ilk, this was their jam.
That would take often very, very exaggerated stories of very, very limited application, practically speaking, but make it seem like they were happening everywhere.
When a single protester in Boston Common burned one Bible, as the crowds told him not to, Viggory's team sent out a fundraising letter that made it seem as though that was the entire purpose of the protest. That was a tactic. Take the actions of one individual or a tiny group and make it seem like a coordinated national story, sometimes employing dirty tricks. For example, a letter that went out over Senator James McClure's signature. They were seeking $2 million to defeat 100
of the most liberal, anti-business, and pro-welfare congressmen.
Among the names listed, Bella Abzug. According to a report by the Associated Press, Senator McClure claimed to have, quote, little knowledge of who the targeted congressmen are or why they were selected. The New Right didn't play by the rules of decorum, using the names of senators on fundraising letters without their permission. That specific campaign was organized by Weyrich's Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, thanks to direct mailing from people like Richard Viguerie.
The thing that was so cunning about it was much in the way no one knew these kinds of scary social media messages that people were getting in 2016 from servers in Russia. No one knew on the level of kind of the pundits and the kind of official political interpreters that people were getting these scary letters. So these very far-right candidates were winning primaries over very strongly financed mainstream Republicans, in the spring and summer of 1978. And then they were winning general elections, completely outstripping the predictions of the pollsters.
They could send out messages and create a base that was outside of the view of mainstream media or watchdogs, because those cards, letters, and fake newspapers were only sent to people Ravco knew would respond the way they wanted them to. Instead of blanketing the entire country with the same mailing, they targeted specific individuals and organizations. Therefore, it was possible for a whole part of the country to be upset about something that the entire rest of the population had never heard of. Much like today, where social media apps serve ads to people they know will respond. These kinds of foreboding mailings played right into what certain branches of religious people were already used to hearing. For almost 70 years, some American evangelicals were living under this scary vision of world history, one that says that evil will increase across time until things get so bad that Christ returns. That concept, premillennialism, was sometimes combined with John Nelson Darby's theology of dispensationalism from the mid-1800s. You may remember from last season that one of the teachings of dispensationalism is that not only is the world going down the drain, but so is the church. So evangelical Christians, especially fundamentalists, were already primed for scary marketing about the decline of civilization. They expected it, and these political messages fell on sympathetic ears. Their motto was, "We organize discontent." Rather than mobilize people towards forward progress or helping society or a common goal, they played on people's fears, bringing people together to fight a common enemy. By the way, this is the same game played by Phyllis Schlafly and Lottie Beth Hobbs. They too lived and died by their mailing lists, which cranked out fear. Their followers were the sword they wielded.
The first real successful kind of new right candidate who used this sort of direct mail fundraising and these sort of rhetorical tactics was Orrin Hatch in 1976 in Utah. But in 1978, several venerable and very successful, and people believe were somewhat popular liberal senators just got wiped out by these people that no one had heard of. So one of the chapters of my book, Reaganland, is called Hang Senator Dick Clark on a Telephone Pole. And that refers to a letter that Richard Viguerie got back from one of these direct mail letters with a check attached. And this person who wrote that didn't care who Clark was running against. They just thought Clark was a liberal and a dangerous. And Clark was a guy whose specialty was keeping the U.S. military out of Africa, right? And it just so happened that Senator Clark, who was a Catholic, was also liberal on the subject of abortion. The Sunday before the general election in 1978, pro-life activists, they put a very influential flyer on the windshields of cars in church parking lots all across Iowa that had a picture of a beautiful numinous fetus. And it read, "See why this little guy wants you to vote on November 7th. And the guy who defeated him, who people had barely heard of, a guy named Roger Jepson, beat him by a solid 2 or 3 percentage points, and something that the pollsters had not seen coming at all. And one of the Democrats' top pollsters went back to study the data, basically, to see what they missed. And he found that 1/4 of voters had switched their vote in the final 2 weeks before the election, that 19% had stayed home. One half had changed their minds over Senator Clark's support of turning the Panama Canal over to Panama, which was a big new right issue. The other half had changed their mind over abortion. The biggest local paper in Iowa said Jepsen's pitch on these emotional subjects evidently paid off. The editorial was called "The Best Man Lost." It was later discovered the previous year that this guy Jepsen, who had only recently had made what he's called a personal commitment to Christ, had also joined a sex club, which hurt his career a little bit. But basically, he was one of, I think, 4 senators who won shocking upsets in 1978. And that really paved the way for what happened in 1980, which was that, 6 more senators lost in shocking upsets. People like George McGovern, people like Birch Bayh, the guy who was responsible for 3 separate constitutional amendments. People like Ted Kennedy's best friend, another Iowa senator named John Culver. And they're all beaten by people who were running on Ronald Reagan's coattails, and if anything, to the right of Ronald Reagan.
New right politicians were coming into offices with generous war chests. Those war chests were filled in part by big business interests, which struck me as odd. I had to ask Rick about this. The new right guys like Viguerie previously mocked big business, but then they tie themselves through things like BIPAC. That's the Business and Industry Political Action Committee, an offshoot of the National Association of Manufacturers, a PAC that the new right guys worked with, despite having previously despised big business.
Yeah, so you often find this. You found this in the Tea Party too, that right-wing leaders, the last thing they want to be associated with are, the kind of economic titans and the plutocrats. So they often, play lip service to being just as much against big business as they are against big government. And, if that was ever, sincerely true, it certainly wasn't true by the time of the Reagan administration. And one of the things I discovered in my research was that Richard Viguerie held one of these occasional councils of war that he did in his, kind of colonial mansion in Virginia. And he invited, all the new right guys, but also all these business lobbyists, and said, we have, kind of common cause here. We got to, elect more conservatives. So, kind of that supposed anti-corporate feint, kind of went the way of all flesh kind of very soon.
And the money they raised talked. Thanks to changes in fundraising laws, spending on political campaigns exploded, especially on the right. In 1972, new right political action committees, or PACs, had raised just $250,000 for congressional races. In 1976, they raised $5.6 million, 22 times what they'd done just 4 years earlier. Yes, the new right had ideas, but ideas require influence. And influence can be bought for the right price. That's just what the new right wanted, to get their people in office at any expense, including Ronald Reagan. The 1976 presidential race would eventually be whittled down to the incumbent, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. But before he got the nomination, Ford had a serious challenger in his own party. Only Reagan wasn't playing politics as usual. There's a fascinating memo from that year that clearly demonstrates how caught off guard Ford's campaign was by the new right's tactics. At that time, Reagan was seen as an extremist, a loud outsider with little or no chance of winning. Yet here he was gaining on a sitting president. This memo was Ford's men trying to understand what was happening.
There is a loose coalition of right-wing political action committees. Many of these committees are set up by or in conjunction with Richard Viguerie's political mail firm. Others have been funded either by a wealthy sponsor, Joe Coors, or by special interest groups like the NRA.
It also lists the Heritage Foundation as well as the Right to Life.
Many of the members of these groups are not loyal Republicans or Democrats. They are alienated from both parties because neither takes a sympathetic view toward their issues. Particularly those groups controlled by Viguerie hold a rule or ruin attitude toward the GOP.
Reagan didn't win the nomination in 1976, but he took considerable air out of Ford's campaign, to the point where when Ford won the Republican nomination, Reagan didn't do the traditional thing and support him. Instead, he sat on his hands, depriving an unpopular Ford of his endorsement. And Ford lost that year to Jimmy Carter. As the memo said, this group of New Right supporters believed in rule or ruin. They wanted to either rule the party or ruin it. You can hear palpable concern in that Ford campaign memo.
We're in real danger of being out-organized by a small number of highly motivated right-wing nuts.
Weyrich and Viggory both were Catholic. Howard Phillips was a Jewish man who converted to evangelicalism. Together, they made their way to a popular TV and radio preacher named Jerry Falwell. With their vast political and ideological machine in place, they turned their attention to stirring evangelicals into a voting bloc. They joined the fight to keep schools segregated. Through organizations like the Moral Majority, they shifted the course of the Republican Party, fundamentalist Christianity, and the nation. A lot of us evangelicals have never heard of the New Right. We don't remember the names of Paul Weyrich, Richard Viggory, Howard Phillips, or others I didn't have time to cover like Morton Blackwell or John Terry Dolan. But they lurk behind many of the events we're covering this season. The Kanawha County textbook war where terrorists were represented by the Heritage Foundation. The National Women's Conference, which was protested by their hordes. The fight against the Panama Canal, where congressional offices were flooded with their letters. Anita Bryant's stand against homosexuals was spread and fundraised by the New Right. And there will be more, including the founding of the Moral Majority and the groundswell for Ronald Reagan. We feel their impact every day. When we find ourselves tied up in knots over an issue we didn't know existed just 24 hours ago, or when we equate Christians with Republicans. Every time we walk to our mailbox and find letters and cards that mix politics and religion. Think about them the next time you sign up for an email list, follow a podcast, attend a seminar. Who are these people? What is their motivation? Are they for anything or just against everything? And where does their money go? The New Right had the influence. They had the team. All that was left was to tie in evangelicals. Special thanks to Rick Perlstein. His books are great. Don't be intimidated by the page count. Reaganland changed my impression of what history books could be. It incorporates not just politics, but pop culture and history in an accessible way. Thanks also to Larry Hughes from Simon & Schuster for sending me Reaganland, and Brian Belfiglio from Scribner for sending me Nixonland. A full list of sources can be found on the website at trucepodcast.com or in your show notes. I'm also indebted to The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald and to historian Michael Kazin for recommending Rick Perlstein. Thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Chris Sloan, Lauren Fry, and my friend Dave Monroe. A special shout out to Patreon supporters for sending me junk mail, including Bruce Williams and Heather Heaton. If you're enjoying this season, why not give a little bit to make this show more sustainable? Visit trucepodcast.com/donate for more information on how to give via Patreon, PayPal, check, or Venmo, which is at Truce Podcast. Truce is a production of Truce Media LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce.